Okay. Yep, that's great. Okay, we're gonna fit a lot of information into this panel, so I'm gonna just jump right in and we're gonna go pretty fast. I'm gonna start the panel by just introducing the topic of what single source workflows are, because I know we have a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, and I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And then I'm going to hand things over to Julie to talk a little bit about some really amazing innovations that her team has done. And then we're going to have a conversation, all three of us together. Okay, so what is a single source workflow? Ultimately, if you want like a one-sentence definition, a single source workflow just means creating all of your output files from the same source file. So creating your PDF, creating your EPUB, creating your Kindle file, and so on. People have a lot of different names for this kind of thing, and there are various variations. Some people would call it an XML workflow, or a digital first workflow, or an automated workflow. Ultimately, at their root, they're all kind of the same thing. So if we look at a traditional book production workflow, because that's what we're talking about, usually it starts with the content. So that's usually a Microsoft Word file that the author has created. A lot of stuff happens to that Microsoft Word file. Eventually it goes into InDesign. At that point, a lot more stuff happens. Usually the text gets edited right there in InDesign, which at that point makes that Microsoft Word file out of date. And then somehow you get from InDesign to EPUB. InDesign actually supports EPUB export out of the box. It's not perfect. It usually requires some cleanup. And anyone who was doing production in the early 2000s remembers when EPUB first became a thing and InDesign did not support it yet. And everyone was trying to figure out how we get from print-centric workflows to these digital files. So relatedly, what about if you need something other than EPUB, what do? Maybe you need a web version of the book, or for example, the Kindle file, or some brand new thing that gets invented for books. And then again, what about the next edition of the book? So you can't go back to that Microsoft Word file anymore. So how do you get your text out? How do you start over? The whole process becomes very messy. Okay, so enter single source workflows. In a single source workflow, all of your edits happen in one single source of your content. And then that content will get transformed to everything it needs to be transformed into, for example, a print-ready PDF, or an EPUB file, or whatever other thing you end up needing. The typical goals for implementing this kind of workflow are to save time, save money, and future-proof your workflows. So again, anyone who was doing production in the early 2000s knows how crucial that word is to future-proof, because you don't know what's coming. So some really quick history. Single source is not new. Folks who went to Books and Browsers back in the early days, or to the TOC conferences, I'm sure saw plenty of presentations about single source, maybe even from me. Originally they were done with something called XML. So XML is just a way to mark up content and say what the pieces of your content are. So this is a chapter, this is a chapter title, this is a plain text paragraph, and so on. When you're using XML as the single source, you're doing all of your edits either in a Word file, and then you're transforming Word to XML. Pro tip, Word actually is XML. Or you're making edits directly to an XML file, which you can imagine is a little bit hard. To get your XML into a print-ready format, You have to use a special language called XSLFO, which is very complicated. You've probably never heard of it. Most people haven't. This is an example of what it looks like. If you're familiar with CSS or other formatting languages, you could probably pick out what this means. But to a lot of people, this is just a bunch of gobbledygook. So you can imagine these were pretty big blockers for a lot of people to implement a single source workflow. You have to find someone who knows XSLFO. You have to find someone who knows how to transform XML. Neither of the coding languages that are required for that are really very well known or well supported. So around 2010-ish.
Probably before that.
Before that, there was a really great revolution in the single source workflow world where we were able to use HTML as our source content. So we could transform our Word file to HTML and then transform the HTML to everything it needs to be. HTML, of course, is the markup language of the web, so everybody knows HTML at this point. And the reason we were able to use HTML is because there were some new developments in CSS, which is the design language of the web, that were made specifically for books and page content. HTML, really well known. CSS, really well known. They are used and maintained by huge communities of people because, again, they are the languages of the web. Okay, so that is the blazing fast introduction. If you're still confused, I'm always happy to talk about it afterwards and explain it a little bit slower. I'm going to hand things over to Julie now.
We need to switch the monitor.
Steve? Yes.
Okay, so I would like to make just an introduction about the design part with web technology and single source typesetting, and more precisely on the design of the printed output. So we should not forget that the web was created mainly for the publication of documents and their accessibility on many outputs. And in this sense, the web is based on the principle of the separation of the content and the presentation that just made before. And CSS is a very interesting language. You can use it to design what your website looks like on very different screen size without changing the content. For this, we are syntaxes called media queries on the bottom. It's an example, which allow you to target which tag will be applied to which screen. But on the very, very first proposal of CSS, there is also something very remarkable that appears. It's print. This is here in this sentence. Current browser considers the computer screen to be the primary presentation target, but CSS has the potential of supporting many output media, paper, speech, and braille. So at the beginning, there is paper on the web. And this is what it interests us. Since the beginning of the web, we have this media query at media print to target the output, the print output. So for creating the PDF in a browser, you just have this option in every browser, this feature. So you print, and this is a layer generated with where the media print can apply on this generated part. But it's not really a good design. It just cuts the page actually. So this is where the book design needs to begin, because the PDF generator just do different pages, but you don't have the presentation looks like a book. Some features are missing. Nellie already talked a little about this, running either page number facing pages. So it's why Pages exists. This is an answer to have this missing functionality. It's a JavaScript library to paginate the content and to create PDF of printed book with the CSS feature we need in the browser. It's not a new product, it's in the browser. It's a JavaScript script. This is a team of Pages, some are in the room. And this is a project that we want community driven, so we invite everyone to participate, because there is 3 points to know about Pages. It's based on W3C's web standard. It's an open and free tool. And also there is visual preview in the browser, and this is very, very important, because it facilitates the access of the development tool. In command line version tools we already have to make PDF, this doesn't exist. But for designer it's very important because it facilitates the design a lot. And I would like to point your attention to the fact that in reality the HTML is not the first single source content. You need 2 different HTML for a website and for a book. Because, for example, a website, each page is an HTML page. But to design a book, you need to have just 1 page with all your content. So it's not really the source file, the HTML. We need to transform it in the second time. And it's more complex than just single source and output. I have an example of this. It's a work I made for a museum in France, a catalogue of Roman sculpture. You can find it, the web version on this link. And I tried to represent the real workflow. Sorry, after. Yeah, this is a real workflow actually. There is a lot of brick on this workflow, and you can see the HTML is in Jekyll part, because we use Jekyll as a CMS to make the HTML, and after we use Pages, but we also have a lot of other tools. I just want to show you, this is a website, and this is a book. I have it if you want to see it. So I mainly do custom workflow with the client I have. So I do a workflow differently each time. There is no just one answer. And we also have a command line version of Pages, because the visual preview is very useful for a design book, but it remains the work of the graphic designer. What is necessary to insert PDF generation in automated workflow, we also need the command line. And for example, with the style sheet provided by the graphic designer, and in this way, the discussion between the graphic designer and the publisher is facilitated with common tool, but each of the people have their own tools they want. And I'm here because I'm here in general. I want to bring in more graphic designer to make books with HTML and CSS, it's my role in Pages, I can say. And there is some example, it's just beginning now. For example, here it's another book made by Sarah Garçon in France. It's a beautiful book. And there is two versions. It's single source publishing too, but with other two. There is the website and the printed book. And here another example I just discovered a week ago. Actually, I was very. It was a surprise that someone said, "Oh, it's made with HTML." Yeah. So it's some example I want to show you today for talk about graphic design in single source typesetting. And I finished.
And we forgot to mention there are a few more copies of the Metamorphosis out on the table, which is a book that we made with Heterus, which uses Page.js at its core. So if you want to see an example of a book that was made with a single source typesetting workflow, it's right out there. And Julie has a few examples as well. We could just leave that. Okay. So before I dive into interrogating these two folks, Dave, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Dave Cramer. I work for one of the big 5 trade publishers, the Hachette Book Group. I started out at working for a typesetting company in Brattleboro, Vermont, just after the age of lead typesetting, and got involved in ebooks very early and have been sort of fascinated by production tools ever since, and have ended up working on ebook standards. And I was on the CSS working group for a while, trying to work on the paged media specifications we were talking about. Now I work on digital asset management systems while still keeping my hand in all these other things.
So just to kick us off, so I got my first job at O'Reilly Media in about 2007. And one of the first things that I had to learn was how to work with XML files. At that point, I had very little coding experience. And I definitely had moments where I ended up crying in the bathroom in my first week, trying to use command line, trying to edit XML directly, because those were the early days of single source typesetting. So Dave, this is mostly a question for you, but from your perspective, how has single source typesetting changed since those earlier days?
When I started, we weren't in that single source publishing model. So this was back in the days of Quark, before InDesign was a thing. But we knew we had to make ebooks, and so we started investigating all these ways to get XML out of Quark, and then transforming it. And so, as you can imagine, this is a pretty messy process and a very expensive one. We had a really good extension, but it cost $35,000. I think it was a one-time cost. That was before we got, extorted by software companies for our money every month. Then we moved to sort of this, what we called an XML first workflow, which was very much what you described in your slides. We actually had the Word document. We transformed that to XML, imported the XML into InDesign, tried to maintain the XML inside InDesign while we were paging, export the XML out of InDesign, and then use that XML to make ebooks. And so, we were trying, but it was still, there were really complex transformations at both ends of that process. And we were still tied to that, print design paradigm that this InDesign file is for a particular term size for a particular edition. And so if we want to go make a different book, we're sort of screwed. We could try to import that XML into a different InDesign template. But again, we're starting to have more and more files that can get out of sync. And there's just a lot of complexity all the way around. I don't know if you want to go on to our solution for that,
Yeah, sure.
which was when we accidentally adopted this true single source HTML-based publishing system, where we had a bunch of HTML files that were the book. You know, in trade publishing, we might do 7 different editions of the same title because there's a hardcover, there's a large print edition, there's a trade paperback, there's various kinds of mass market paperbacks. But in the web paradigm, that's just so simple because it's the same HTML, different CSS style sheet. So we could just literally keep that. Here's the book, and I point a different style sheet at the book and then hit print basically, and I end up with hardcover or I end up with large print depending. You know, I tweak a few things about the point size and what font we're using, and all of a sudden we had this system that just eliminated millions of those complex steps. We always knew exactly what our master file was. So if we had a core content creation, correction, someone found a typo in the first edition because it happens, and then we just fix the master file and we don't have to worry about versioning and all sorts of other complexities. So it just really streamlined everything.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear sort of the progression of what single source looked like throughout the years for you within these roles. I know for me, I've had quite a few different jobs that implemented single source workflows, and they all looked a little bit different. Like Julie said, it's always a little bit different depending on the organization. So my very first job in publishing was at a math journal, and we did all of our typesetting with this markup language called LaTeX, which is probably only going to sound familiar to anyone who works in math specifically. I worked with XML, I worked with HTML. So single source, it can exist in a lot of ways, and you're not really limited to just this one HTML CSS workflow. That said, I do think it's the best one. Okay. So I'm wondering if you can tell me a story about something that you were able to do because you had a single source typesetting workflow that you might not have been able to do with a traditional workflow. And I have an example myself, but I'll let you go first unless you want a minute to think.
I think one of the things we did in going to the single source workflow, we also insourced. We moved production from offshore typesetters to people in-house, and just the simplicity of the tools and having fewer steps in the process and doing it in-house made it possible to do things really quickly. We have done same-day turnarounds on manuscripts. We get a manuscript from editorial at lunchtime, and we have first pass pages to them before the end of the day. And that would have been utterly impossible in other workflows, or we could, we need an ebook for NetGalley or something. We need to do all these things. We can do things in minutes that would have taken several days with more complex systems that had longer lines of communication.
My example is really similar of you can actually have multiple people working on a layout file when you're using this kind of workflow, which if anyone is really familiar with InDesign, that's almost impossible to trade an InDesign file around and have it open perfectly and have all the text flow exactly the same way. So the ability to actually have multiple people collaborating, adjusting pages, making edits is pretty revolutionary.
Yeah, in a designer point of view, it's the same. You can just begin your design when the content is written, and this is so awesome because most of the time we designers is just at the end of the process. And now we can discuss about, for example, the structuration of the HTML with the publisher and the author. And in the same way, the publisher and author can see the result of the book at the same time we write it. And for example, one day I work on a collaborative project with 10 authors, each author has a chapter, and they see each other what the other do, because it was a publication on a website with a little animation and scrollytelling. And I design with the author what they want, and the other see and say, oh, it's a good idea, maybe I want to have this too, and this transform the content too. So it was a real discussion with all the people involved in this workflow. And this is something we can do with InDesign, for example.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, sort of the ability to get design involved in the process very early. Okay, so obviously single source is great. Everyone should be doing it. So why aren't people doing it? Why haven't more people implemented single source tool chains, or what are the roadblocks for implementing a single source tool chain, both from a general perspective and with HTML specifically?
Oh, this is a complicated one. I can speak for my corner of the publishing industry, where people are extremely reluctant to do anything different than their competitors. There is a certain safety in everybody using exactly the same tools. You're not going to get fired for, using InDesign. And so doing something different requires some sort of a push at the start. In our case, I think it was mostly an accident. It also depends a lot on what the people at the company consider important. One thing InDesign can do is you can do literally anything on a page. You could set every letter on a page in a different text box and then position every one of them pixel by pixel, overlap them. You could do sort of anything you can imagine. And with these tools, there's not as much flexibility to get that sort of pixel by pixel precision. And I would argue that having that control sometimes is bad for the end content. But if you're in an environment where, editorial or proofreaders, just tell you, I want this, change this word bank in this way, move this, if they're going to be completely prescriptive on what every element of the page looks like, then you can have some pretty significant cultural clashes around things like that. That being said, we had to do a lot of work to make these kinds of systems be sophisticated enough typographically in order to pass muster by our editors. I joke that when I first set up the system, it took us 3 months to get an ellipsis that looked right to everyone. So there were definitely challenges there, but we use a different, we use a proprietary tool that turns the HTML and CSS into PDF, but it has really good hyphenation and justification support. We had to work on those issues a lot, because that's sort of the key for what we do of typesetting long strings of text, that the justification has to be really good.
Yeah, this is bringing back memories for me of implementing an automated tool chain at Macmillan that didn't have any visual tools like that. It was purely automated, and the battles that I had with editors about, maybe you don't have to fix every weird hyphen at the end of the line, or like maybe 3 lines on the last page of the chapter is passable. Which coming from, I know. There are things that you do definitely have to give up, or historically have had to give up with these kinds of single source typesetting workflows. I do think the types of projects that Julia is working on, and the type of tool that you built, and the type of tool that I've built, have all been really good attempts to fix a lot of those problems, and really get beautiful typesetting using browser-based tools. So I think it's sort of a new world these days when we're talking about single source typesetting, and you don't have to make those same kinds of trade-offs that you used to have to make.
I think there truly are trade-offs, and I think like we did really different things because, single source doesn't mean fully automated. And so, I know that some other companies have done workflows that are pretty much fully automated, that you get to the point where you tweak all the sources so that when you press that button, that's what you get. We went the path where, given the nature of our editorial departments and stuff, that we had to be willing to do a lot of hand tweaking, and we found ways to do that. But our idea was, I think humans are really good at making the trade-offs that typesetting requires, and so we would rather, automate a lot of the process so they can focus on, okay, this is a really awkward paragraph, how do I get it to break so that there's not, horrible hyphenations, and so that our chapter doesn't end with 2 lines on the last page. And so that's where we want people to apply their skill and judgment that's been honed over their decades of experience, and then let the tools do all the other stuff.
Yeah, I just have an anecdote about this from the Village Aragon just show. It was 4 years ago, so I was not really with a big technical background, so I just say at the end of the design of the book, I just stop the exchange with the editor to say I want to finish the typesetting, and actually the editor haven't finished the edit, so it was a big mistake. I redo the typesetting 3 times, and it was very hard, but no, I think I have the ability to make this with more feedback, not in an automated way, but just adding some HTML, I don't know, span or break with CSS that didn't show this when you are on screen and show this when you are in the print, so we can do it more efficiently than I did at the time.
Yeah, in fact, I think the 11 a.m. panel today, there's going to be a few examples of how folks have implemented automation at varying levels, and so I think it's going to be a really interesting follow-up to this conversation. Okay, so those are sort of technical and design reasons that people have historically not implemented single source typesetting workflows. Again, when I was at Macmillan, I absolutely ran into some political problems as well of, convincing everyone that this is something that can work for their books, that their team will be able to adopt. Do you want to talk at all about sort of the political and change management aspects of this kind of deviation?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier about how doing something different has its challenges, but you sort of hit on that in your original presentation about the skills required to do the different types of workflows. We've gotten a lot of objections about, learning CSS to the level of being able to operate within the page media environment. It's not a skill set that people who apply for jobs have typically. And so there's been concern about like the level of training it would require to become, to come and work on our system, for example. We've had pretty good luck bringing people up to speed. I think, the challenge is more on the book side than the tech side, knowing what a book is supposed to look like. There's a lot of subtlety to that doesn't even exist in the general graphic design community. You can be an expert in Illustrator or InDesign or something and have no idea about how a trade book should be laid out. And so, we have challenges on that side, and then just, there's, maintaining the systems. It's actually come to the point where our system is going to get shut down because it's different, basically, and they wanted to standardize across the whole company, across very diverse product lines. we never used this system for like 4-color complicated books. Its strength was on, this multi-edition, straightforward fiction and nonfiction. And so we're going to end up using the same tool for everything, even though it's not suited for some of what we do, in the interest of having only one path.
Yeah, that's really sad to hear. From a management perspective, I can absolutely see how maintenance would be really important consideration, especially since a lot of publishing companies aren't software companies. They don't have the infrastructure to maintain that kind of software. I do think there are some publishers who are making changes in that direction. And I'm truly sad to see Dante going away. We only have about 4 minutes, so I'm going to jump around a little bit. I have a few more questions I wanted to ask. Okay, this is sort of a big question. So a lot of us, when we talked about single source workflows, we think of the historical days where it was XML and it was very hard. But with new tools that are based on HTML and CSS, even though it does take a certain skill set, it makes the landscape a little more approachable. That said, we're still not seeing a lot of publishers take up these kinds of tool chains. So this is really a question for Julie. Who is using Page.js?
So I came from France, so I can talk about the European perspective. And there is a small community of graphic designers that use it because they didn't want to use InDesign because of political and ethical point of view. So web technologies are open source, so they use it, and they use it in very experimental way, I would to say, because they also want to have a reflection about this is a web on a book, so I can code, what can I do with this? And there is beautiful example of things that mix media. For example, I have a friend that just use a camera to write in the background of the page. There is a lot of creative coding, generating visuals. So in France, it's very graphic design part. There is also a small publisher with textbook, and that's all I can see. And I'm invited in a lot of school to make workshop about this and to think in other way to think about the page actually. Because when you code, you have a multiple possibility. So this is more an experimental way, I can say. But there is also beautiful book you can see. You can just have a normal book.
Yeah, and of course we also use Page.js at Headers and built a lot of special sauce on top of it to make it work specifically for publishers. And there's a whole other topic that we could talk about for probably another 10 or 15 minutes, just about how you make a tool work for content that's coming from a lot of different sources. So at a big publisher, this might be a lot of different imprints. Maybe you have one imprint that's nonfiction focused, and one that's literary, and one that's sci-fi, and how do you make a tool that works for everybody? And I think that's a problem that we've all faced. Unfortunately, we only have about 45 seconds left. So if you can give a one-sentence recommendation to someone who wants to implement a single source typesetting workflow, what would it be?
Just go download something and play with it. I think that's one of the real strengths of the whole HTML ecosystem, is that you can go dive in and look under the hood and see what's happening. And there's if these tools aren't free, some of them you can download them for personal use, like prints, and just write some HTML, figure out the command line, see what you see, and iterate from there. There's a lot to learn, but it's easy to start.
Yeah, just don't forget the graphic design.
Okay. Okay, and I think that's a great place to wrap up.